Can we, Kathy, can we start? You, you just have to push a button, right? I'm just a little I've got to catch an airplane tonight. So I'm a little nervous. I'm ready. You ready? Okay, you guys, welcome to the Law and Licensing Committee. It is we're great in spirit, but small in numbers. And two of our members asked to be excused. One has a funeral today and one has a wedding tomorrow. So that's where the rest of them are. I said and let me just say, my name's Carol Lear, and I'm the chair of the Law and Licensing Committee and a board member over District 7, who represents all the children of Utah, but specifically the elected from the Park City, Salt Lake City area. Cindy, you want to introduce yourself?
Cindy Davis, board member.
Thank you, Mike.
And Mike Haynes. All the children.
Yeah, don't we all? As do we all.
Yes. I'm sorry for being a little late.
Yeah, we were at the USDB and getting, but through many school zones, behind school buses, legally was really hard. So anyway, we are happy to be here, and sorry that it seems such a big space between us and you, a literal space as opposed to the figurative space that everybody's so fond of these days. But we are going to move what I was just going to say when we started the introductions. We are going to move the discussion of third-party providers to the end. I would say 3:15-ish, because we are so few in numbers that some of the finance committee members were going to join us for the discussion. So it will make for, I think, a more interesting and substantive discussion with a few more board members. But that means we have to wait till later in the agenda. So we will start right off with the first item on the agenda, which is R277-715, out-of-school programs. And to help us with that is you, Angie? Oh, Camille Shank and Robert Palmer. Thanks for being here, you guys, and waiting on your Friday afternoon. So why don't you folks come to the table and introduce yourselves, and one of you choose to tell us a little bit about the rule. It's pretty self-explanatory, so the short version would be fine.
Chair, we also have Tracy Gruber joining us from the Department of Workforce Services, who's here as a guest, and she probably would be happy to answer questions if needed. But we worked with DWS, specifically Tracy, on this rule also.
Glad to have you. And yes, we will, if we have questions, we'll ask you too if that's. So whichever one of you is the primary spokesperson, speak.
Camille Sheik, USBE Education Specialist. So with this rule, it's about out-of-school time program standards. So there was law that passed around codifying after-school standards, high-quality after-school standards for our out-of-school time programs. And we had some changes in how we measure quality. So prior to this, or when this rule and the code, we were using a self-assessment tool. And now we use a self-assessment tool as well as an observation tool, a validated observation tool that's used nationally with different after-school organizations. So that's the addition to this rule.
Okay, anything, Robert, you need to add?
No, exactly what Camille said is great. Thank you.
What she said.
Yes.
Does anybody on the committee have questions? I have a couple of questions, but I'll defer to you folks first if you have any. Mike, Cindy? Okay, go ahead, Cindy.
I need to use this right. Who's doing the observing?
So it's our designee, and right now our designee is a nonprofit organization called the Utah After School Network. Their staff have been trained in this tool. There's a national training they attend. They go through different reliability checks throughout the year to ensure that they're using the tool in the way it's meant to be used.
Thank you.
Mike, did you have anything?
Not yet.
Not yet. I had a couple of questions. One, on line 12, it says, "The purpose of this rule is to set standards for high-quality out-of-school time programs," which definitely does, "and establish the programs required to adopt these standards, those standards." I don't see that the rule really establishes the programs. Am I reading incorrectly, or? I'm going to just give you a sec to look at it and see what you think.
I think
not
it's
as-
referring to the USBE and DWS funding. So it's geared towards the programs that are funded either by USBE or Department of Workforce Services.
And that makes sense, but the
The language.
what would you say, Angie, on line
Well,
what?
I'm wondering if, what you're asking is if we reference the actual grant program, because I think maybe that's what the confusion is, because this rule does not govern the grant program is in a separate rule, but maybe what we could do is we could say, participating program means a program that receives funds from the board as described in R277, and I can't remember the number, if it's 709 or,
15.
no, but there's another.
7,
I think I was asking a little bit different
Okay,
question.
okay.
Let me try again.
Yeah.
So the purpose lays out the standards beautifully. It doesn't seem to establish the programs.
Gotcha.
So I'm wondering if we just either end the purpose statement with set standards for high school, for high-quality out-of-school time programs, period.
And/or describe the programs required to adopt those standards, because maybe that's what it
Maybe
meant
that's
to
what we're-
say.
Do you think it
be-
describes?
Well, it just says, it's essentially, it's a program that receives funds from the board or the Department of Workforce Services to support out-of-school time programming. So,
Right, and just in the definition. But there's only one section, and the section is on requirements.
right. And so the question, I think, is, in the definition of participating program is where we define which programs are required to adhere to these standards, because this was a question we actually had from the superintendents, which is, if we have after-school programs, but we're not receiving funding from either the USBE or DWS, are we subject to these standards? The answer is no. And so I think that's what we're meant to say there, we're meaning to say there, but maybe we could do a better job. We could, but you're right, we
So
could.
let me suggest that, and we'll make these, there's a couple of other things I had, but I would just suggest dropping the comma and saying, and defining, and let's see, the purpose of this rule is set standards, and define the programs required to adopt those standards.
Yeah.
So drop and change establish to define. Does that suit you folks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
good.
We'll fix all those in a minute. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Just, have we addressed equity in here at all? I didn't see it, and I didn't know if now was the time to,
You mean in terms of who would be the participants?
yes, and how that is.
You have, can you point us to one of the standards, or?
You'll want to turn your microphone on, Camille.
Yeah.
I thought I had it on.
Yeah,
I apologize.
Kind of knock those off. Components there on line 46.
Yes, I don't know, so so with the self-assessment, the quality tool, that specifically deals with some equity about including all students, and one of the things around staffing is ensuring that if you're able to, hiring staff that represent the youth you're serving, or making those connections, if your staff don't represent the group of students you're serving, making those connections through programming, maybe bringing professionals in. So that is one way we address equity.
And Mike, were you concerned about the equity of the participants, or the equity of the staff? Or the opportunity for?
Student, staff, and program.
And line 78 says recruits, hires, and trains diverse and qualified staff members. So there we deal with the staff
Staff,
members.
but student or program.
Uh-huh.
I have a question.
Sure.
Camille, do you remember from the grant requirements themselves, do they talk about providing any sort of, not incentive, but maybe encourage for certain populations or demographics of students?
We do have in the competitive grant process for the different after-school grants at USB 21st Century Community Learning Center grant and the Intergenerational Poverty After-School grant, there's certain priority points about if you serve a certain percentage of the schools or the community centers have a higher percentage of families who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. If there's a high rate of intergenerational poverty in the school, that's a priority point. We encourage them to really do a needs assessment to see what students and families, what are their specific services that should be targeted for them, who's not being served, where is the gap in services.
Falls right in with.
So is it one of, so should it be or could it be one of the, I think it's an excellent point, and so section 3, right on line 34, parentheses 1 starts with a participating program shall. Should it be one of those shalls? Is it that?
So one thing to remember is this rule also governs DWS,
Okay.
not just our board's grant program. And so that's why I was trying to pull up, just
Okay.
FYI,
If it
we have a
refers back
rule.
to that already includes an equity component that,
And I don't, so R277718 is our out-of-school time program quality improvement grant.
Okay.
And just wanted to bring that up because some of these issues might be better addressed in that rule versus the standards for the program. And maybe you all could help us distinguish what would be, as we're trying to address some of these issues, if it's better placed in 715 or in 718. And we could bring 718 back, for example, next month, if there's something that you see today that you think, oh, we'd really like this to be changed, we could bring that back, correct? Okay.
And in the code itself, the law itself, it does refer to when you're making, giving priority, that it is a requirement to include schools or centers that serve students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. So it is in the code itself for this specific rule.
So the law that establishes this then provides
Yes.
for targeting free and reduced
Yes.
price lunch students. So does that
okay.
make you
Yeah,
feel better?
if that's, if this is built on that and
Okay.
it's supported by that, I'm,
Okay, well, let's see, like funding. Those are all the questions I had. Did anybody else have any other thoughts? Does anybody in the audience, Tracy, would you like to speak to this, or are you all good? She's good. Anybody else who was here to, I don't have anybody signed up, so I'm assuming that no one else wants to, not to belabor that. Okay, then with that, I will accept, I guess, how do I place my motion? Do I just do it?
Yes, so you just make a motion to just replace the word establish with define on.
Right, so I would make the motion that we delete the word on line 12, delete the comma after programs and the word establish and replace it with define as just a minor syntax change. If that's okay, I'll make that motion. We don't need a second. So all in favor of my motion?
Aye.
Aye, good. And then that passes unanimously. So with that, I will accept a motion to approve the rule as amended.
I'll make a motion that we approve the rule as noted.
Thank you. All in favor? On the motion is to approve R277-715 as amended.
Draft one as amended.
Draft 1 even as amended.
On first reading
On first reading.
And recommend.
forward to the board to
outta
be
here.
approved on second reading.
and final reading.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Camille, Robert,
it's
thanks
an
for that good explanation. And item number 2 on our agenda is our, not third-party providers for any of you latecomers, but action item number 3, R277-613, LEA Disruptive Student Behavior. And this is amended rule with a continuation requirement. So welcome, Corby to help us with this, and Angie will also, I'm assuming.
Yes.
So, you want to go ahead and describe this situation to us? Thanks, Tracy, for coming.
Is it on? Oh, okay. Corby Easton, Prevention Specialist in Student Support. This rule was brought to the,
Legislative
State of
Administrative Rules
Rules.
Review Committee.
yeah, and they gave us feedback on 2B about relational aggression. And me, Angie, Michelle Buse, like, tussle and turn with terms, and we decided to just
It's just say uncle.
yeah, just strike it out. And so that's
Okay, then. So the main change is on line in the mid, toward the middle, is that right?
36 through 38,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do
Do you mind if I add something
No,
to
please
the
do.
conversation?
Please.
Yes, just as Corby stated, we were asked to present to the Administrative Rules Review Committee, and they specifically asked or had a problem with subsection 2B. The other thing that we did in this rule, which isn't really substantive, but I noticed that in the authority section of the rule, we hadn't listed all of the sections of code that give us authority to promulgate rules or enact rules. And so I went ahead and added the sections of code related to bullying and discipline that do provide the board with authority to govern discipline in schools, bullying prevention, et cetera. So you'll see all of that, which is lines 6 through 18, is simply adding those other sections of Utah code into the authority purpose, and then eliminating lines 36 through 38. As Corby stated, we were not able to come up with any alternative language that didn't have its own problems, so we
I think,
just,
I think
yeah.
it might be helpful for anybody in the audience who's interested in the committee members to hear what I heard about what the administrative rules problem, what a legislator had a problem with.
Yeah. Would you like me to summarize
Yes,
that? Yes. So there's a definition of bullying in code, and I'll go ahead and click on it right now. And you can see that the first part of our rule, the definition of bullying simply directs us to the statutory definition. As Corby and others were working with stakeholders, and a while back, the Law and Licensing Committee, as we were working on amendments to 613, enacted a bullying prevention work group. There were a couple of board members who participated on that, as well as LEA stakeholders. One of the requests from that group, and it was from one of our district administrators, was to include some examples of emotional harm or some of the examples of bullying that come out not in a physical way, but in an emotional way. As we looked at this language, it was a bit of an oversimplification because there's a standard that states that when you're bullying, it often has to be pervasive or, persistent or pervasive? And,
Davis, it's from
Yes.
the U.S. Supreme Court case.
yes, or block or stop the student from accessing education. And so we tried to figure out ways to maybe codify that. However, it's tough because emotional harm is about the student or the person who's receiving it versus the action of a person, which again is why we opted to eliminate those lines. And then I think Corby will, through when at training and questions that people get, oftentimes, and I don't know, Corby, if you want to take a couple minutes and explain that this is a tough one to help train educators on or to identify.
yeah. So matter of fact, just like 2 weeks ago, I received a call from a parent regarding a relational aggression that led to more physical regression. And so the relational aggression wasn't resolved. And because the hardest thing about relational aggression, most of the time you don't see or find any evidence because it's done either when it's two students are are one-on-one and no adults or other people are present. And so, but it escalated to two students getting physical with each other, and it led to other harms. And so the parent just was asking for help. Like she just exhausted all resources trying to figure out how can she support her student to be emotionally and mentally prepared to receive her education. And so it's just a constant one of the difficult things that parents, schools have a hard time with relational aggression.
But the short answer is we can't do it in a rule. It doesn't sound like we'll just have to do it through training, right? So any other thoughts or questions? I had one more question. Might you have any, Cindy? Yes? Oh, okay, go ahead. Please. Is that appropriate? Sure.
I attended the meeting, and
Administrative rules review.
yeah, I found it textured and odd. I'd like it just written in the note for public record. I mean, I'll vote for the change, but I think that we need to ask the question, where is the greatest area of liability? Because the reasoning brought up by those that were concerned was that we could be liable for going against someone else's rights who's doing these things. Where is the weight on the scale? We are responsible for protecting people's rights, but we're also responsible for protecting people while they are in our educational institutions. So I would like that question in our records of our committee. And again, I will support this, but I think it begs a question, where's the weight on the scale? And I think that we can support this because the word, emotional harm is written into the law. And what this will do essentially is leave those specifics up to the LEA, who were asking us for specifics, but now we're going to put the ball back into their lap and say, you essentially will need to define the specifics. So I just kind of want that noted that I'm going to support it, but it's precarious.
And let me just add, Michelle Buse, our assistant AG, also has a comment, but I also, would agree with you. Where is the greater liability? And potentially violation of someone's rights versus someone's safety, and relational aggression is probably, you know it when you see it, but we certainly have a big problem with it in schools, and it would be nice to be able to acknowledge that in a rule, but discretion, better part of valor sometimes. Michelle, would you like to speak to that? Right.
The legislature did not feel the same way.
Sure, go ahead, please.
And Board Member Davis's comments actually reminded me of a question I was asked, but I wasn't allowed to answer it in the committee meeting. So thank you for refreshing my memory. That the chair of the committee asked whether there was liability that maybe this rule was going to cause us to violate students' free speech rights. And I got a little flustered because of just some different things. But the answer I wanted to give, and Corby, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that if anything, there's more of a risk, a liability risk of under-identifying students who are the subjects of some of this behavior, and that all of the calls, not all, but I think the last time you and I spoke, you had received not one call about somebody's free speech being violated, but instead multiple calls of students who have been subjected to emotional harm or this relational aggression, and that administrators are not identifying it, and that oftentimes then those students turn around and become the aggressor because they feel they have not been supported.
south.
Yeah.
That's helpful. I did, and maybe Michelle answered this question, but Corby, I had one more question, and on line 84, it says, subject to availability of funds, the superintendent shall provide a model policy on bullying. That is available now?
Yes,
Is that,
yeah,
is
yes,
that right?
yes, and
For
that's,
LEAs?
yes.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I just had that question.
So does availability of funds need to be?
Well, maybe if it needs to be re-upped, we would want to hide behind that if we don't get it done as quickly as we should. But it does exist. Thank you. I don't know, what's your druthers? Would you rather delete that?
What line?
On line 83, 84,
Subject to availability of funds, the superintendent shall provide?
just, so we could just start that, the superintendent has made available or shall provide, and
Shall
then,
provide?
if, that's that what your motion is?
Can I ask a question?
Well, this is more casual than that, but would you like to make that motion, Mike?
I'd like to discuss it, maybe.
Okay.
Since there are only three of us, it's like we have all this freedom today.
That's kind of how I feel. I don't
The
have
sky's the
I don't
limit.
have anybody to control.
Gosh. I guess, so my question is, there are more responsibilities underneath the model policy. So because
yeah.
the model policy is created, I
Right.
still think, I wonder if we might want to have availability of funds because we're not sure to what extent we can provide training.
Reporting.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Evidence-based.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Good point.
Yeah.
Duly noted. Thank you. Thank you.
And can I make one more point too, along with my notes? I appreciate our opportunity to work with our legislators also. And I hope that we can have collaborative processes. So just because I found this particular piece odd, I just want it noted also, I'm grateful that they can express what they want to express and hope that we can do the same.
Yeah, and that can be respectful. Thank you. Michelle, did you have something?
There is this,
Uh-huh.
and it doesn't make.
So we could start with a 1 and then go to the 2.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you could do that. You could. So I think you could just add subject to availability of funds in front of B and C, because I think those are the two that need to be modified. But yes, Michelle's correct. The section of code's right there in A that requires you to, well,
Write the
requires,
model policy.
have a model policy. So would you like to move subject to available funds to the beginning of 86 and 91?
Yes.
We could do that.
You think so, Mike? Is that, you're willing to
I
make
think
that
that would
motion?
make
Okay.
more sense.
So the motion is to move the subject to availability of funds so that it precedes wording on line 86, model training and all the other things below that. But we will say that the superintendent shall provide a policy regardless. So that's the
I like that.
motion. All in favor? Aye. And so
Got it?
that was, and I forgot to ask if anybody in the audience, now after the fact, well, no, we haven't voted on the rules. The rule as a whole. So that was my only question. Does anybody else in the audience have any comments or questions about this rule that they'd like to address or make? Okay, going. Thank you very much. With that, I'll accept a motion on the rule. Mike, Cindy?
Okay. I'd like to make a motion that the committee continue and approve R277-613, Draft 1 on first reading, and forward it to the board for continuation and approval on second and final reading.
Perfect.
As amended.
As amended.
As amended.
Yeah. And so the motion is, I'm not supposed to repeat this.
You are.
Okay, so the motion is that the committee recommend R277-613 and approve it on, as amended and as to be continued on first reading, and forward it to the board for final reading, and make sure that that rule is amended. And so that's the motion. Amended and continued, and for a first reading, I think we got all the pieces in there.
Yes.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. I think that's a unanimous vote. Thank you, Corby. I think you're not, well, we'll go to maybe Travis for the next. Isn't Travis the next one?
The
Right,
next
to
one
go
is
back
Travis.
there. And
No,
so action
it's
item.
Leah, actually. Isn't it?
Action item number 4 is R277-324, Paraprofessional Paraeducator Programs, Assignments, and Qualifications.
So Jeff is not here right now. Leah, am I correct that you, okay, Tanya.
Oh, please. So please come up and
Do you all mind?
introduce yourselves.
I'll just give some background while they're
Please.
coming up. This rule is being amended because the guide or the handbook, I believe, or the guidelines that are incorporated by reference have been updated. That's kind of the background, so.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Tanya Semerad. I'm education specialist in special education and have taken the lead on some paraeducator projects.
Tell me your last name again.
Semerad.
Okay, thank you very much.
Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support.
Okay, do you want to give us any more background, or one of you talk to us about this more?
Do you want to tell them how long you've been working on the manual and just a little bit about the process?
Okay,
Brief.
so there was a paraeducator handbook that we had, which was a wonderful handbook, and stakeholders and USBE employees put together many years ago, but it was 90 pages long and was really more special education specific. And so we took on, well, I didn't take on, I adopted about a year and a half ago, revising the handbook and turning it into what we're calling now a manual. And we wanted to make it a little bit more accessible for LEAs and instructional paraeducators across the board, not just special education paraeducators. And what we've done is taken it down to about 23 pages. And we've got a lot of resources that we have attached to that manual as well that we're excited about. But it's been in the works for over 3 years. It's been on my plate for a year and a half. And it's done, and it's on our website, which is very exciting. But really, just so you know, the paraeducator manual is focused on the standards, which the paraeducator instructional standards, which were passed in 2015, and really kind of tries to dive down a little bit more into those standards and give LEAs some guidance on what competencies our paraeducators, our instructional paraeducators should have. Yeah.
The work that Tanya led was cross collaboration. Title staff, teaching and learning staff, special education staff, literacy and numeracy participated. It's a really good product. We have tons of feedback from LEAs. It's exciting.
Do you have to add?
The only thing I was going to mention is actually the handbook is not incorporated by reference. I apologize. It's just been updated to match what is in the handbook.
Yeah. Okay.
So that, I just want to clarify that.
And the two match the standards,
Yes.
as Tanya was saying. That was really important, that the rule and the manual matched the standards.
That consistency is really nice.
It's my understanding that really the changes in the rule are just technical changes so that we're all,
yeah.
it's all aligned, yes.
You want to explain the renumbering, Angie?
Yes.
Yeah, and I just had a couple of questions. We'll come back to that in one second, but I had a couple of thoughts. It looked like there's a typo on page 79, despite all this collaboration.
Oh, no.
Not a big deal, I just want to make sure. Not 79, then maybe I got it, line 79 to 80. Maybe I lied. No? Knowledge of and ability to assist. Or maybe I had an older version. Or maybe I've got the wrong rule. Hang on one second. It was the area about the parent who's also the paraeducator acting as a oh, here it is, line 104. I don't know why I got the line numbers wrong. So I just had a thought on line 104, paraprofessional who has only parental involvement or similar responsibility. I don't know that you really have parental involvement. If you just would indulge me, a paraprofessional who is involved as a parent or has similar responsibilities. Is that okay? So I just had that, and I thought it was a typo, but I can't
Well,
find it, so it must have gone away.
The A's should not be capitalized, so that's another thing I found.
Oh, good. So with that, without objection, can we just do that?
So a
Grammatical
paraprofessional who has, and can you state it again?
Who is involved as a parent
Who is involved as a
or
parent.
has similar responsibilities.
Okay.
Is
That reads better.
that okay? I just, because you don't really have, anyway.
Yes.
You got it. So without objection, can we have we'll just make that technical correction, and then can we have a motion on, then that's when the discussion of the renumbering takes place. So we need to repeal the R27, we need to repeal this one.
524,
Right,
correct.
524, and then we actually need to make the motion to accept 324, which will
Yes.
have this language in it.
And I will make those amendments that we just
Okay.
described in 324.
Okay, so first we need an amendment to repeal, or not an amendment, we need a motion to repeal R277-520. I guess we better, yes, please.
Just a question on lines 65 and down, requirements for paraprofessionals. Sorry, that's before January 6th. We want the after 2002. Paraprofessionals hired after 2002, that's line 85 and down. Does that come from federal requirements to use Title I funds? And who's monitoring that? I mean, do all of our paraprofessionals right now have at least one of these things?
Would you like me to respond, Chair?
Please.
Yeah, so in order to use Title I funding for the paraprofessional has to meet these requirements from ESSA and had to meet requirements in the previous version as well. And that is monitored. Val Murdoch, our Title I monitoring specialist, that information is put in the grants management system and it is monitored.
Do we have anything similar to paraprofessionals across the board? Or is it isolated just to this?
So that's the only place where it's required. Title I is the only place that requires it. Special ed rule, R277750, requires that paraprofessionals providing specially designed instruction and/or related services have training documented, training and supervision by a licensed professional. So that's a different rule, but this is the only place that the experience, training, education of a paraprofessional, all of that is required. However, we do provide the same resources, the availability that Tanya was talking about, to all paraprofessionals, paraeducators. So any paraprofessional, whether they're paid with Title I funds or not, would be able to access the training that's available, but you have to meet these requirements to be paid with Title I funds. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Heartening to know that training's available. That's great.
Here's an additional question if I,
Sure, please, go ahead.
since this is on our agenda right now. And this may be for another day, but maybe, does the work that you are doing include innovating about how to recruit and retain paraeducator, sounds like you're doing a lot of work in that induction part in the middle and the training part. Are we thinking about ways to recruit and retrain paraeducators? Because they're so hard to come by. I mean, on top of a salary, I mean, the money is always an issue, but is there any other work being done? Is it appropriate to ask that question since we're talking about paraeducators?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. Yeah.
I don't know if this fully answers your question, but having been a teacher that worked with paraeducators for most of my career, I think one of the reasons that I saw a great deal of turnover had to do with not being appropriately trained and supervised, because we put our paraeducators in situations where we have high expectations of them, and if they don't know what they're doing and they don't have the support behind them, they're not going to stick around. And so I feel like this doesn't answer completely what you're talking about, but the resources that we have started, have completed, and are planning on, I think will help with that. Because I do think that's a big part of the problem, is not getting appropriate training and supervision. So if we can really, here at the USBE, can be providing guidance in that, I think that helps with the problem.
And let me just add, we have programs in special education where we use IDEA dollars to pay paraprofessionals to participate in that training, because most of them don't have personnel development time, professional learning time, because they're 17 and a half, 19-hour-a-week employees. So we have programs where we use special education money to pay them above and beyond that time that they're working in a classroom to participate in training. And one of the reasons we do that is specifically for retention purposes.
Thank you.
That's so helpful to know. Thank you, Leah. Thanks for that question, Cindy. We have Chair Huntsman, who has joined us because we are missing 2 board members, so he has joined us for our conversation. So please feel free to participate. Yes, another question. A motion. Oh, a motion. We need to, and just so, we first need to pass R277-324, and then we'll repeal R277-524. So yes, if you would make that motion, Cindy.
I move that the committee approve R277-324, Draft 1 on first reading, and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
As amended.
As amended.
The motion is that the committee approve R277-324 on first reading, Draft 1, as amended, and pass to the board for second and final reading.
Yes.
And all in favor of that?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Now, do you want to make the second motion on 524, the repeal?
So I move that the committee approve the repeal of R277-524 on first reading and forward it to the board for approval on second and final reading. No amendment.
As amended. Not even an amendment.
Yeah, just
Nope, we
repeal.
didn't have to amend.
Yes, so the motion is to, the committee recommend that the board repeal R277-524, and we will pass that on to the board for their consideration, second and final reading. And that's the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Thanks very much, Leah, Tanya, thank you. That was a really helpful introduction.
So if you wanted to do 472, Jeff would like to be here for 609.
Okay.
And he's down in finance, supporting
Okay.
another rule. We could do 472, then go back if you'd like. I
That'd
don't
be
know.
great.
Okay.
So, next, we're going to, under the agenda, hang on a second, let me warm up my computer again. We are going to R277, of that part, dash 472, which is number 6 on the agenda. And we'll have that discussion. This is one that's been delayed a couple of months. Charter school student enrollment and transfers and school district capacity. Who's going to discuss that?
Ben?
Ben? Oh, okay. Ben, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about this?
Yeah, Ben Rasmussen, Director of Law and Professional Practices, thank you. So this is a rule that has been before the committee for a few months now. We continued it as written, but we still haven't kind of taken action on the technical changes that were made. Draft 4 is the current draft of this rule that's before you.
5.
Draft 5? Oh, draft 4 was in my packet, I'm sorry. So,
What the changes were. Oh, can I?
Sure, if you want to help Ben out there.
Yes, sorry, I don't know, I think you were there, Ben. We, yesterday, I believe you had left, so, so that's why you weren't aware of draft 5.
Okay.
Sorry, I took over from draft 4 to draft 5. We meet with a group of superintendents and charter representatives the Wednesday before board meeting, and right after the meeting had ended, one superintendent brought up a very good point, and it's this language here on lines 11 or 10 through 18. The content of the rule, he didn't have any problems with, but he felt like the purpose statement didn't quite match the body. It's similar to what you did in 715. So really, this rule does not govern all transfers from charter schools to districts, or even from one district school to another district school. It's really about when a student leaves a charter school and would like to re-enroll in their boundary school within their district, school district of residence. So I worked with him and a couple of others who had stayed behind, and I apologize, Ben, you had left at that point.
That's okay.
And I forgot that. And just to reword it a bit to clarify that this is really limited. This is not open enrollment. That's a whole nother process which has different timelines and statute. It's also not charter school lotteries or any kind of admission into charter school, but it's really specific to when a student is going to leave a charter school to go back to their boundary school. And that's all the changes do, you'll see.
And draft 5.
Yeah, on draft 5. That's all from draft 4 to draft 5. And I believe draft 4 is also the same draft we reviewed last month, but was tabled. So the only substantive changes since the last time it was before you are the language changes there in blue and red.
And I recall that our concern from past months was the date, which is on line 148 still, is that the?
148, correct.
And so Cindy, I don't know if you had any other thoughts to add about this date, which still says now June 30th.
Yeah.
And we're going to leave it June 30th, is that the plan for now, or
Well,
no?
I'll just give you a little bit of background. I visited with our charter directors and said, what does this do to you if this district school reports in April instead of in June? And there was an interesting discussion that I don't think ever really got to the heart. And they said, survey us, and then we'll tell you. But then I contacted a local district after that and asked the same question. What are your thoughts about moving the date to April 15th versus June 30th? And this person said, well, we used to release our FTE in March for hiring March and April, but now we're releasing FTE in January. So it's not even going to help to just move the date to April from, it's just, there are concerns across the board. And I felt really sad. I mean, one of the charter directors said, we can have, from the time we budget for FTE, a difference of 60 students between then and the day that school starts. So we're hiring, we're budgeting, we're financing. I know that districts in certain situations can have similar situations. So a couple of things that I think we need to look at. One is we don't have any control over the code, but the code is inaccurate when it says that the initial, looking at transfers, it says the initial windows of, I don't even have the numbers for you, of enrollment, and Royce Fantaslo, I saw walk in, you correct me if I'm wrong, are in April and May. And I asked the directors, how many of you have your initial windows in April and May? And Basement West conference room was full, and nobody except the one gal on the front said we might start then. And there were, so it's inaccurate. So the code is inaccurate as far as that language goes. So I think that I'm going to make a motion in a minute about that. But I think we also need to look holistically. Everybody I talk to says parents are never going to change. They're going to change their minds the last minute. They're going to apply to 5 different charter schools and not tell us. It's never going to change. Are there places in code or policy that we could help start the ball rolling? As a parent, communicate with me. I can start to change. If I start to understand repercussions over years, we can change the dynamic of understanding, and hopefully we can get to a better position in this area. So that's the background on this. I think we need to move forward on this today because we have to. But the whole thing, in my opinion, is not effective. It does.
Okay.
So I'll let everyone else say, and then I'll make my motion. But
Just wanted to mention that the same superintendent who asked for the technical changes described there also said, for him, any movement of the day earlier, he would appreciate. So there was a feedback from one superintendent.
Go ahead.
And this superintendent, or BA that I talked to, said it would be helpful to move that up to April 15th too. But for now, I think we need to look at it more holistically and then bring it back and make change, whatever we need to change.
And taking the chair's prerogative, before I turn to see if there's anybody in the audience who'd like to speak to this, I think one of the challenges is setting a date, but holding to it. I think that will be the challenge, because I totally support that, but then we're going to have 15 exceptions that I think frustrate our intention to put something firm that helps both districts and charters balance their employees.
Can I make a question? I think that if there is a date change at some point, once we kind of look at this more holistically, it shouldn't be a mandatory. It should be an option for the boundary school on this date to say we're full. If, they should have local control to make changes if they need to.
That's helpful to
But
know,
an
too.
option.
Does anybody in the audience want to speak to this? Royce, would you please introduce yourself and then speak in that order?
Royce Van Tassel, Utah Association of Public Charter Schools. Appreciate the time that this committee and especially Board Member Davis has spent talking with us, trying to work through that. I think there is general agreement that the earlier that communication starts, the happier everyone, frankly, is going to be. Most of these decisions by parents are being made in the January, February, March timeframe. I mean, that's to be expected. There are some times, I know occasionally you will see that happen late, but to your point, if it becomes an option, say now we're full and we want to move that date, that seems reasonable. But I think we want to encourage earlier communication and more frequent communication throughout. You're right that we need a statutory change to make that happen. And that's fine. We'll be happy to work with you in making that happen.
Thank you. Thanks for your comment. Anybody else have a comment? Yes, Cindy. For Royce?
I have a question for Royce. Jennifer Lambert suggested we send out a survey to all of the charter directors. Is that something that I should do? Should I initiate a survey to all of them about this? One of them caught me in the hall after and said this would help everybody in there. But how should I go about that kind of communication? What are your thoughts?
There's probably two relatively straightforward ways that you could do that. I'd be happy to work with you, and we could pull a survey together through the association. You could work with Jennifer and do that. Either one of those are going to work just fine.
Okay.
Do it through these, but make sure not everybody's a member of the association, not every
Oh, no,
school.
our list will go out to everybody.
Right. Because I think we've got a broad range of
Sure.
schools. Sure, Angie?
We also have a list of charter directors, and I believe it includes all of those who are charter schools authorized by the State Charter School Board, as well as charters that are not. So if you two wanted to work on the survey, I could send it out on your behalf or something. Or the committee could make a motion, because that might be even better, so that it's not one board member or Angie.
So
Want to start with that motion?
I want to start with a broader motion because I don't want to waste their time if we take a more holistic look and something is going to change more than just a date on the code.
Okay, so you have a different
So-
motion in mind.
I will make a
And
motion.
that's better made before we pass the rule?
I think so.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
That's all
it
right.
doesn't matter either
Doesn't matter
way.
to me either, go ahead.
Okay. I move that we ask staff to look at associated codes to R277-472 and policies to see holistically if our enrollment windows can be more effective.
The motion is to ask staff to look at the legislative rules and legislative statutes and then policies and the rules and see if we can do a better job with not open enrollment, but this transferring between charters and traditional schools. I kind of butchered your motion. Is that kind of your motion though? Okay. And get information from staff on that. So that's the motion. All in favor? Aye. And there you go.
Got it.
And then I think with that, we're ready to make a motion on the rule. Guys, it's giving us a lot of practice on motions.
Draft 5.
Draft 5. I'll place that motion. I move that the committee approves R277-472 draft 5 on first reading and
No amendments.
and forward it to the board for approval on second and final reading. All in favor? Aye. That is unanimous and so done. Next on the agenda is R277-609. Jeff, that would be you and Corby again. Item number 5 on the agenda. R277-609. And thanks, Royce, for your comments. Introduce yourselves and then explain.
Jeff Van Holten, Policy Advisor for the Board.
Corby Eason, Prevention Specialist for the board.
Okay, would one of you like to tell us about why we're talking about these changes?
Yes, so as you may recall from last month's committee meeting, we had 609 before you, so you could see some proposed amendments that centered mostly around updating some of the language in 609 to be compliant with the juvenile justice and restorative practices reforms that have come in the last couple of legislative sessions. And also to seek your feedback at that time. We were not seeking to pass the rule, but to get everyone's input on what other changes or discussion they might have regarding the rule itself. And this committee spent a majority of its time looking at the 30-minute requirement and offered some suggestions in that regard, as well as the immediately notify language. So as you go throughout the rule, you're going to see we changed immediately notify to reflect the request of this committee that it say as soon as reasonably possible before the student leaves the school. And then if you jump down.
And let me just stop you there because I think the superintendent's had a thought about that. Angie, is that the appropriate place?
Yes, just as we're talking about notification, and it looks like, at least here in draft 3, that's been noted, that the term notify was changed to provide notice. They felt that was a better wording than notify, because what if you made multiple attempts to notify and you weren't able to actually catch somebody? So,
Which was the question we
yes.
had discussing it.
So
Right.
they recommended provide notice.
Okay, so now it says that, do we?
Yes, is it all throughout draft 3, Jeff? I think
It should
so.
be, yes.
Okay,
Looks like it right here.
so provide notice instead of nothing.
Yes, and if it isn't showing up online, I'm not quite sure if the new draft 3 was uploaded, but I do have a text into Sybil so she can get that uploaded so you can see it just in case it hasn't gotten up yet. And that's an example of that would be down on line 244, where you can see we add in as soon as reasonably possible in terms of the notice rather than it being immediate. And just further down in the discussion around the 30-minute limit, there was conversation in this committee about hard and fast 30 minutes, or do we want to add some other qualifiers to that? And in working with staff after and looking at some other options, you'll notice we retweaked that section on lines 248 down to 253. So now the public education employee may not use physical restraint on a student for more than the shortest of the following three options. 30 minutes is still the option and would serve as the ceiling. It would be 30 minutes or less, essentially. The first option is the amount of time described in the LEA's Emergency Intervention Training Program. So one thing that staff pointed out was there are several LEAs that actually adopt a program that has less than 30 minutes as a requirement, so it would make sense that we make sure our rule considers the fact that some LEAs might be holding themselves to a stronger standard. And then there was a conversation in this committee about holding until law enforcement arrives. So if it's shorter than 30 minutes and law enforcement gets there, then allow law enforcement to take over the situation at that time. So we put that down as option C as well, but just for the sake of clarity, it is the shortest of the three, so 30 minutes still serves as the maximum. Otherwise, the changes that you're going to see throughout here, which are noted in purple and green, are more technical in nature, but those are the substantive changes based on the feedback from this committee last month.
Okay, any questions?
I do.
Okay, please, go ahead.
If a student is in danger of hurting himself or herself or someone else, and it goes beyond the 30 minutes, maybe parents have been contacted, they're waiting, does line 253 force them to call law enforcement? Because there's no option for a safety situation.
Yeah.
So the line itself does not require that law enforcement be called in relation to this. The law enforcement line here on 253 is only in relation to how long you restrain the student. You have three options to choose from, and it's the shortest of the three. So if law enforcement arrives at minute 25, then that's when you need to stop the physical restraint. But if they show up at minute 32, you should have stopped at 30 minutes, if that makes sense. But it does not require law enforcement be contacted at all.
So what is your option if a student is in danger of hurting himself or someone else after 30 minutes? What are your options?
So I'll begin to attempt that answer, and then I might toss it to Corby to kind of give the more application-based experience that he's had in schools. But the best practice is being trained to nationwide is if after 30 minutes the restraint is still not working to de-escalate the situation, you need to reassess the intervention you're currently utilizing, including the physical restraint, to de-escalate. So the idea is after 30 minutes, if it's not working, you need to change what you're doing. Again, that's conceptual thought. I might now toss it to Corby in terms of like how the application works itself.
Yes, I can give you several examples. I can give you an example of hurting self. So if someone is in danger of hurting himself, hopefully we get notify the parents, and also we had an NCOP team to come out and evaluate the situation and determine what's the next step. And so with parent involvement first, to notify the steps. Then also, like Jeff mentioned, after 30 minutes, try another intervention. So the intervention that you're not working, try another one. Like, for example, you're restraining a kid for 30 minutes and not working. The best option may be is, I'm not going to go there, sorry. Yeah, I don't want to go in the rabbit hole, so yeah. So there are many options that we hope that administrators, they are trained to be able to assess what's going on. And that's why it's so important to do the front part of this rule. So what's interesting about this rule is talk about all the preventative things that you should be able to do beforehand. After you exhaust those things, then you contact people who are more trained to handle those situations.
But not, and I don't want to start a sentence that way, but however, you've got sometimes situations where you don't have any choices but to keep holding on to a kid. And I think I'm answering my own question and saying there's really no penalty for violating this rule. This is something that we all acknowledge is the better practice, and we're aiming for it. Is that correct?
May I
Please.
answer that? Yes, so it's really for training purposes, to train, to LEAs, to exhaust as much resources as possible, and more as training.
Does that help a little? No, go ahead.
Having, one of my positions in the past was working in special ed over 20 schools, K-12, and, you know, this doesn't happen that often. This is a last resort type of situation. But yes, I have seen situations where you're waiting for help, you're waiting for support, you're waiting for the parent, you're waiting for the law enforcement, you're waiting. And sometimes, you know, I just don't want employees to look at this and think that they are going to be in breach of some kind of policy or law or rule if they don't let go at 30 minutes, whether or not the child is safe or not. So I was hoping when we came back to the table this month, there would just be a tad more some kind of language that recognizes there may, in extreme situations, you're not going to be able to let go. So in a very extreme situation, I was hoping there would be some type of mitigating language that when an educator read this, they wouldn't feel that they were going to be in trouble thinking the way they think.
And
if they didn't let go, no matter what.
I had the exact same concern when I discussed this earlier with the staff, that I don't want it to be used to punish educators who really have no choice. That was my concern. Well, it says in R277-472 or 462, wherever we are, 609, that you held that student for 35 minutes, and this is another violation with on your laundry list of things that you've done wrong, and so now that's 3 strikes. And that concerns me, Chair, just one, anyway, that concerns me, Cindy, as well. I was sort of assured that this is aspirational, that there really is no punishment, but I can see it being used against a teacher. Chair.
Okay. And the education community that I visited with over this 30 minutes rule is, there's a practical side of it. How many teachers can actually hang on to a student for 30 minutes? Okay, and so they said, well, if it's a real extreme case, very seldom somebody's going to be able to restrain. One person's going to do this. So there'll be a release, there will be an assessment, and most likely have to go back to that restraint again, which falls within this if there's, you're talking about physically holding someone, and a release, part of an assessment, if they have to hold the student again, then they will, and they felt that's how they would work within this rule, because
So the timer starts over again, is what you're saying.
it would start all over again, because 30 minutes, and I can speak from my wife, I could speak to my wife's experience, who just retired, that's like was in this element and stuff. There is no way she's going to physically hang on to someone for that period of time. So it's got to that letter of the rule. So the ones I've talked to, they understand what's there, but they believe that they'll be in compliance with that.
I can
Thank you.
But it's not
totally
in rule.
support that, because that is realistic and reasonable, but that's not written anywhere here. And how is it written in the training?
Go ahead, if you have,
Like,
Corby, please.
for example, MAT system training, they say release at 3 minutes and reevaluate what's going on. And so those trainings that like the LEAs use, I mean, it's very, very shorter than the 30 minutes.
That's the That's a lot shorter than 30 minutes is what you're
Yeah.
saying, but that's Matt training. Cindy and then Angie. Go ahead.
I do understand that. I have been through that. So that makes sense, and the reassessing makes sense. So let's put a line in the policy about reassessing. And I'm trying to come up with a motion really quickly on my
So think on that
mind.
for a sec. Do you think of
Okay.
that, Angie? Did you have a comment?
Yeah, just one other, in that same meeting that we had earlier this week, I just thought that this was interesting, and I apologize, I didn't do the independent research myself. But while the group of superintendents and charter reps were discussing this rule, somebody in the meeting did a little research and said that the vast majority of the states, or the majority of states, have a 30-minute max. That's a very common standard. This is not an outlier, or, that most do have that. So
What does their language look like?
that's a good question, and we could do that research and take a look. And if you wanted to, you could pass the rule out and have us kind of give some options of rewording that before it comes to the full board. I don't know, Leah, do you have any ideas? Have you seen any other language? Right.
Do they have any language? Do they have any language about
Just
reassessing?
reconnect.
If there's a safety issue, if they have to try other interventions and then if they do need to do that again, that's not counted in those minutes? Is there any language like that?
Leah, do you want to come up and, sorry, just so we can get you on the recording? Right, there's a mic right there.
Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support. So it's been several years since I did MANT or PCI, so I don't know, Corby, if you've done it more recently than I have, but I don't remember specific language, to your point, Board Member Davis. There's definitely specific language about the reassessment, but not, I don't remember a time frame between reassessment and returning.
Yeah, so they talk about just rely on your state and federal policies.
Right, it's always
Yeah,
go back to your
for
state rule, yeah.
Can we add the words reassessment somewhere in this policy to give the tiniest bit of, I worked with
Wagon
so many
room.
kids and I only really needed to go beyond the 30 minutes in very, very, very few instances. But is there a way to add a reassessment piece in this?
There is. I could read an example. Again, this is your decision, but if you wanted to put reassessing language in on line 249, you could say, and I'll start at 248, a public education employee may not use physical restraint on a student for more than the shortest of the following before reassessing the intervention used. And then boom, boom, boom.
And did you have another comment, Royce? Spirit of group discussion?
Again, Royce Van Tassel with the Charter School Association. This issue is something that is perhaps a little bit more prominent among some of the more rural districts, but I can think of at least one charter school that has the issue. There are places in this state where law enforcement could easily not arrive within 30 minutes. I mean, not even close, whether you're looking at some of the parts of Box Elder School District or Uinta River. And so, one of the questions that we asked when we met with Angie was, what is it that might trigger the starting the clock over again? And if the rule with that reassessment language allows you to start that clock over again, then the issue of 30 minutes and how far we are becomes much easier. But, my dad grew up out in the Uinta Basin. If you're in Tabiona, maybe. I mean, how many officers are on duty to get out there across an entire county?
Can't get to Grouse Creek that fast.
Exactly.
So I like the reassessing language. Do you feel better about that? Did you get that, Kathy and/or Angie?
No, it's a substantive.
Yeah, I think we need to add it as an
Maybe
amendment.
restate it, Jeff?
Please, Jeff.
Sure. So it would be amending line 249 to add after the shortest of the following before reassessing the intervention used.
I think that allows for some flexibility, at least, a little more flexibility. So, is it, Cindy, is that?
Yeah,
Feeling
the
okay?
other option, that could be an option, or we could put, yeah, that's probably the best thing. It's a little bit nebulous, but if it ever comes into question in court, they could come back and listen to this
Well,
conversation,
I'm
perhaps.
truly, my greater concern is for a teacher being used against a teacher, and this rule cited for that purpose. So I'm just going to have to remember, all of you witnesses, that we understood that sometimes this happens, and it's not a career killer if that is the situation. So the motion is, if I can place the motion, to add at the end of line 249, more than the shortest of the following before reassessing the situation.
The intervention used.
Intervention. For intervention?
The intervention used.
Before reassessing the intervention used. Okay, and that'll be the end of line 249. And so I don't need to that's kind of nice because I don't have to repeat the motion again. So all in favor of that? Aye. So is that Cindy? Yes. I just restated it. So with that change, I don't think, did you have any other questions, Cindy? And Mike, you don't have any other questions? Any other public comment? Please.
Hi, my name is Nate Krippus. I'm a legislative and policy counsel with the Disability
name
Law.
again.
Nate Krippus with the
Okay.
Disability Law Center.
Oh, yes, I know you.
Yes, you do, Carol.
Good to see you again,
Good
Nate.
to see you as well. I think we just did want to point out, and I don't know how often it is happening or not happening when these restraints happen, whether law enforcement is traditionally called or if it's not. But I think we do have some concern with, adding the when law enforcement is called, just because it does seem to encourage involving law enforcement. And as this policy will be, frankly, more likely to be used with students with disabilities, we have some concern about kind of disproportionately impacting kids with disabilities with the involvement of law enforcement. In addition, we do appreciate the attempt to keep it lower than 30 minutes or 30 minutes or less. However, the other concern with involving law enforcement is it's essentially as a school employee can do it for 30 minutes, but if law enforcement arrives, well, sooner, but then the question is, does then law enforcement, are they able to restrain the student?
And we,
And I know you can't get, I'm just saying that's our
That is
concern
the
is
question. That is the
that does it just really allow for or encourage the calling of law enforcement and bringing their involvement, and then increase potentially the physical restraint because law enforcement comes and may continue restraining the student.
and that's probably a training issue that I would hope we would discuss.
And so I think the other question I guess I would have is, I don't know, are there model policies for, from the board or anyone on schools for restraint and seclusion? Do we?
That's probably a Leah question. I
We
hate to
plan
make
to
her walk
work
up
on
here
that
again.
after
I
this
was
rule.
going to have you just stay, but thank you. And she can use Corby's mic.
No, it's fine.
I'm not letting anybody leave anymore. It takes so long.
Sorry. Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent. Will you restate?
I'm just curious if there are model policies regarding restraint and seclusion from the board that is available for, I know there's mention of man training and things like that. Like, I don't know if, it doesn't seem to me that that's like a requirement that all schools have somebody who's man trained, or if there are policies regarding what training anyone should get regarding these matters.
So we have the least restrictive behavior intervention manual
Yeah.
that does go through all of those requirements.
Okay.
And includes best practices related to each
Okay.
as well. There isn't a model policy in the manual, however.
Okay.
Is that the question you were
Yeah,
asking?
I mean, most I'm asking is, but I guess it may be addressed in the other manual.
In the,
And just for the record, the manual is incorporated by reference in the rule, so technically the manual is part of the rule and the law, so.
Okay.
and to kind of further that thought, an LEA school district charter school would be subject to that manual. So it operates as kind of a requirement on the school, whether, despite the fact it's not in a policy.
Okay.
And then Corby?
So there is a model policy for 609 that needs to be updated, and that's why
Oh,
we,
so there is one that's in process. So there's the better answer to your question, Nate.
Oh,
May I just add to the second part of your question, which was about the type of program that an LEA chooses to use? So the USBE doesn't require one specific program over another. However, the USBE does. So Corby and I actually put together an RFP last year to provide training to LEAs, especially smaller LEAs that can't afford their own training. We put out an RFP. We wrote all the criteria as related to the rule and the LRBI manual. And we had, what, Corby, five different programs responded. And we went through the procurement process, chose one, and are providing LEAs with the opportunity to receive training on emergency safety interventions. And so they do have that opportunity. USBE is providing it for them if needed.
For free?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
But we don't mandate a specific program. Even though that one won the procurement process, they could use any one that they wanted.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Does that help?
Yeah, and I think the last thing I would say is I know there was some discussion before I came up regarding other states' policies and things like that. I know there is a report that I have that I would be happy to share with whoever likes it on kind of, that does go through different states. Oh, that one right there?
This one?
This is the one.
Somebody
Okay.
sent this
We
to
have
me.
that.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yes.
That was, I was just gonna say, if that would be helpful, I would be
And
happy
if
to
you'd
share it.
like, I
but-
could ask Sybil or Kathy actually to upload this.
Sure.
So it'll be there on Civic Clerk moving forward. Would
I
you
think it'd
like
be
that?
helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
For the boards, I think for the board's discussion, it would
Yes,
be helpful.
and when it goes to the board.
Right, Cindy?
And I just want to address your concern. That was my thought initially when I read this too about calling law enforcement. And I do think adding just the opportunity to reassess, try other interventions. If there's a safety issue, we may, in extreme situation, so we don't have to call law enforcement. We could try some other things. And if we have to keep a child safe, we can without calling the police.
Right.
By adding that language in, it was my intent to help mitigate that concern that you expressed. I'm ready to make a motion.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you, Nate, for your comments.
I move that the committee continue and approve R27-609 Draft 3 as amended on first reading and forward to the board for continuation and approval on second and final reading.
And the motion is that the committee recommend
Sorry, I took it away. I gave it to her.
that the
R277.
R277-609, draft 3 on first
amended.
reading and as amended, and on first reading and forward it to the board for continuation and approval on second and final reading. That's the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you so much for that discussion. That was so helpful, and I appreciate the give and take. And Leah, thank you for jumping in and adding your expertise. So thank you very much. And we are finally, I think, to the last item on the agenda. Maybe? No. Did we? Okay. So the last item on the agenda is item 2, LEA third-party provider services. We really started the discussion last month and didn't get very far into it. And maybe if any of you were here, you were as frustrated as I was that we kind of talked around it and didn't get into it. But we're going to try again and address some of these questions. And it's a discussion. It's a little like herding cats. So I'll warn any of you that are more linear than I am that it's not going to be the most linear discussion we've ever had. Kevin, you were going to assist with that, I thought. And I think we'll start with an introduction by Kevin, and you can introduce yourself. And then I just had kind of broken the rather stream of consciousness questions down to about 4 or 5, and then maybe we can address those and come up with some ideas and maybe ask some questions of the staff and make some requests. So go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, so my name's Kevin John. I'm the audit manager for the Internal Audit Department for the State Board of Education. So to provide a little bit of context, as you're aware, the state of public education is changing. One of those changes is the way in which we deliver our critical functions. So today, many of our critical functions in public education are delivered via outsource, right? We outsource it to both nonprofit and for-profit entities. So please note that in that aforementioned statement, there is no value judgment language in that. We're not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it is a different thing as the volume of outsourcing is increasing. So with different comes inherent risk. And so the purpose of this agenda item is to raise one's awareness to the inherent risks that comes with outsourcing some of those critical functions. And so to Board Member Lear's point, there are a number of almost rhetorical questions within this agenda item. They aren't necessarily meant to be answered, but to raise one's consciousness or awareness of some of the risks that could be associated with this outsourcing. So essentially, it does boil down to maybe 3 or 4 high-level questions, such as, are there critical functions that should or should not be outsourced? What's an acceptable or appropriate amount of critical functions to outsource? You know, is it appropriate for an LEA to outsource all of their critical functions, for example? Do we have adequate internal controls to provide assurances to the stakeholders of public education that the objectives of public education are being met? And then maybe finally, who should make those determinations? Is that a determination that should be made by the legislature, by the state board, by LEAs, by individual schools, whoever? So ultimately, again, the purpose of the agenda is to help us understand, are we aware of the risk associated with outsourcing of critical functions? And if so, are we properly managing those? And so that's what I have for you today. I am prepared to answer any questions you may have if you want to tackle some of those specific questions. But again, they were, given the fact that this is a discussion item, more rhetorical than actual. And just to get us thinking again, are we aware of this? Do we see the trends in outsourcing? And if so, is there anything we want to do within the State Board of Education differently than we're currently doing to try to mitigate those risks?
Thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. And we've got a couple of, another board member has joined us. I was looking for more than one. And Laura, if you'd like, okay, then Chair Huntsman, we also would invite you to make any comments you have. And if anybody in the audience has comments, because we can use all the help we can get to address this, and I think this is the spirit of discussion and collaboration to solve our concerns and the concerns of others. So if we're okay, I think we could just start with, and we'll call on your expertise in a couple of places, Kevin, in a minute, but I just wanted to start with the overarching question, and I think AAG Buse will be helpful too, because I have a question for her eventually, but start with the overarching question of, excuse me, what services are and should be provided by the public education system? Of these services, what could appropriately and effectively be provided by an external provider? So maybe we could just start by saying, what's your experience with some of those services that are externally provided?
That's an interesting question. Clearly, my experience will be anecdotal, and I can't speak to everyone. It would be limited to the audits that we have done. But what we are seeing is we are seeing an increased trend in the outsourcing of external critical functions, whether that be outsourcing of providing teachers, teaching services, accounting or management services of that nature, fundraising services. Essentially, in short, there's really no shortage of opportunities to outsource critical functions. The question again is, is there certain critical functions that would or would not be appropriate to outsource? And volume is another question, of course, that would be associated with that.
What are the services that you've seen that are outsourced? What are some of them?
Essentially everything.
And so just give us some specific kind of,
So
Right.
like I mentioned, teaching, for example, outsourcing teaching, right? So you have a management company that's providing all the teachers for the school.
Okay,
Is that or
teaching.
is that not appropriate? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Again, there is no value judgment associated
No.
with these questions, just simply raising it.
Business services.
Business services, right?
Payroll.
So, yeah, payroll. So essentially, any or everything can be outsourced. Again, the question is not necessarily which particular services, although it could be part of it.
Chair Huntsman?
I think if you took a list and said, okay, what are all of the functions that a public school has to make? I think you can find in every category some level of outsourcing, with the exception of the board, the LEA board. From management to custodial to food to purchasing to the education piece of teacher, well, training was one of the first, some of the early, there's an evolution that happened in our state too, but we're going from teaching to standards. I've heard that. Well, I bring this and these are the standards, and I'm going, oh, I thought we had Utah standards, but almost all aspects, and that's why in the audit, in our audit committee, that this is a new concern. And to add to that concern, you say, well, how much of that's happening, and what percentage? Is it 10% of those, and to what magnitude? And what's happening here on the outsourcing, it's whether it's profit or nonprofit, these are LLCs, and is it turning public education into private, a public school into a private school because of the amount of outsourcing that's taken place. Those are the kind of the questions and the magnitude of it going out, but it's kind of hard to find one part of the services that are rendered by the school that on the LEA side that is not
Outsourced in some LEA at some time.
at some time, and in some it's almost all. So we're seeing this trend, and it's like, okay, what do we see with that trend? And for us, it's a simple. We can keep it. We can make it difficult, or we can keep it simple. We're in the education business, public education business. We have standards. We have our whole package of Utah's public education, and we're having to deal with students, programs, dollars, and we're in the monitoring business. We're in this business. The new challenge that this board is facing and our USBE staff is facing is when we're out there in the name of accountability, not so much auditing, but even on the monitoring and kind of making those assurances to our stakeholders that things are being done according to our policies and our standards. Is as this is moving out, we hit this corporate veil of the LLC that we have no right, no jurisdiction, nothing we can't go past that. We can only hold the LEA board and there's accountable, and we're finding some challenges with that. So I know I'm taking too much of your time, but so the challenge here is in all of the services that we provide, in order to keep it simple and practical, to have the conversation with all the third-party providers that I kind of wish had the opening part of all of that is what do we need to do on our end to have those assurances and have accessibility to the third party? Do we want to have accessibility and access to the third party provider, or do we just leave it up to the LEA that wants to contract all of that, and then go to the and hold them accountable and review submittals and pieces of whatever we need from a third-party provider? Now, that's just on part of this monitoring piece. The other piece of this, and on programming that, is the student itself. And I've talked to a few board members about my analogy of the USBE umbrella. And we create rules, or not, oh, yeah, we have rules and that are in place to do our very best to protect and have assurances of what happens with that student that's got our USBE umbrella going around, and it goes to this district, it'll go over to the charter school, and under this umbrella is kind of a certain layer of protection. And then what happened, the question is, what happens to that umbrella when it leaves a charter school or a district and goes into the third-party provider world that we can't see past. We can't see it, we can't monitor it, we can't do anything.
I'd suggest they're not entitled to our umbrella.
Well, is there? This is the question, because it ends. It's not there unless it's somehow contractually obligated by LEAs that umbrella goes over into that third-party private side.
Well,
And I'm just talking on the student side.
Cuts both ways.
And then there's all of the other operating pieces that we're talking about that, does the umbrella stop or does it continue? And then the other big question that we have on the third-party provider side is, we had, and I call it the color of money. We have all this money, and it's got different colors because it's restricted and for this purpose. And we have a really good way of kind of making sure it stays in there, but as soon as it passes from an LEA's hand to a third-party provider, what assurances do we have in place? How can we monitor? How do we make that right in our scope of work that just ended quickly? Is that relevant to the public education community that we have access to that? So I'm just separating the whole, there's a couple ways we can separate this out.
A myriad of ways. Cindy, you had a comment. Did you remember it?
Well, yeah, I don't know if you're finished.
I'm
That's
sorry.
kind of, no, that's just kind of the beginning piece. Party providers are fantastic. How do we keep them? Dollars intended to be. It's just not how it's just not the end result, but there's a process of procurement and all these other things that we at USBE, we're accountable for it. Nobody's taking that away from us. Whenever there's trouble, it comes right back on us, whether it's federal or state or some kind of program money. And so those are kind of the questions as we navigate through the whole third party. And then one of the big things now is at what point, when we're talking about percentage, when does public education, we're talking dollars, but having to do with dollars and services, when does that public education become private because of that LLC veil that?
It's also vice versa. When does the private become public?
Correct. So that's all part of the discussion. And that's what's kind of hanging out there, that as from audit and that's what's come to your committee, and I thank you for allowing me to be here. In fact, it's kind of fun to get to participate on some of your other stuff.
Oh, well, I'm just thinking it should have been in finance committee to begin with. But Cindy, or Michael?
Mike has
Mike.
I'm just curious, through the dialogue that you just gave us, in the scenario of a third party providing a service, which is needed, and does the LEA govern that contract? Or does that default somehow back to USBE, dotted line somehow, and then what place do we have?
Can you bring Michelle up?
Michelle, do you want to speak to that? Michelle, okay, you can introduce yourself.
Michelle Buse, Assistant Attorney General. In the procurement code, the responsibility for oversight of that is in the procurement entity. And because each school district is its own procurement entity and each charter school is its own procurement entity, they have the ability to do that. And under Utah procurement code, their contracts have to require that the procurement unit be able to go and audit the subcontractor or contractor's records at any time. So that leaves the responsibility to enforce the terms of the contract and make sure that public money given to that procurement entity is used in an appropriate manner. And there are some LEAs who have a really direct responsibility to the taxpayers through votes. And then there are other LEAs who don't have a direct feeling and interaction with the taxpayers because their money comes to them through a buffered method in the charter school world. So that's a reality. Right. Is LEAs feel very much connection from the taxpayer if they are a school district because their money comes directly from the voter.
They should.
So there's some pressure there to
Can I ask for
make sure.
clarification? Is it okay with you?
Yeah,
Did you
certainly.
have other questions for Michelle? I had a kind of clarification. So you're saying under procurement, if I heard you right, so correct me if I heard you wrong, you're saying under the procurement code that if an LEA contracts with an entity, the LEA must be able to then audit, monitor how that money is
I
spent.
will read it to you. It's 63G,
No, I trust you.
6A,
I'd like you to read it.
1206.3.
Okay.
And it says that a procurement officer or an audit entity under contract with the procurement unit may audit the books and records of a contractor or subcontractor. And it is limited to those records that are to do with their contract. So they wouldn't be able to go into the contractor or subcontractor and see all of their records to every customer or client they serve. But
Right.
to see the records that are substantive to them and the contract that they have, yes.
And who do you believe would control deciding what was relevant to the
That would be something between the procurement entity and their contractor.
They decide in advance, their contract would decide maybe
don't-
in advance?
I don't think their contractor has to, or their contract has to say
decide.
that in advance, but it should have the terms and conditions that cite that under Utah procurement code, this contract has to comply with, and your delivery of this contract has to comply with Utah procurement code. And
Okay.
that's part of the code.
Kevin?
So I want to make a point of clarification as well here. A lot of it depends on where the source of funds come from. So initially, if the funds come from the federal government, we become a pass-through entity that then passes those funds on to an LEA. And through that relationship, we have responsibility as well to monitor the use of those funds to make sure they were used in accordance with the sub-award terms and conditions. So although specific to the contract, yes, that the LEA has responsibility, but likewise, depending on the source of funds, the state might likewise have oversight. So every time essentially that you are passing funds through one entity to the next, you're creating a sub-recipient type relationship, or potentially, depending whether it's a contract or a sub-award, that then creates additional layers of oversight. So clearly, the federal government would have oversight over us to make sure we used our funds as stated. We would then have oversight over the LEA oversight over their contractor, sub-recipient, so on and so forth. So it creates layers like an onion of authority and responsibility.
Which brings us to the difference, which is one of the kind of streaming questions we have in our outline about the difference between a contractor and a subrecipient. Could the argument be made, Michelle, Kevin, that essentially all the money that goes to an LEA makes the LEA is the subrecipient, and maybe everything that goes out from the LEA, those are all subrecipients because it's all money that comes from the state? Would that be inaccurate?
Does bond money, if they raise money
Not,
through a bond?
that there are,
So
there are
that's different.
some,
Yeah,
I
that's-
mean, yes, I guess if to the extent it's divided or distinguished or siloed, there's some money that comes through state and WPU or program type money, and those are subrecipient funds versus those that are raised locally to the extent they're differentiated. But Michelle, you were shaking your head.
I don't think that it automatically makes that. I'm just searching my little thing for the provision that shows you a distinction. There is a distinction between a grant and a contract.
And a contract.
And a subrecipient contracting for services. Like if it's special education money,
That's a subrecipient.
they are a subrecipient, and USBE's authority is to see whether or not they're complying with the terms of IDEA
Yeah,
and the state's
federal
provision of the special education rules. So there's nothing in it specifically that would allow you to go and dig down into the contractor's records. You would just be able to see whether the services that they provided
Okay.
met the terms of the contract and the legal provisions that they were intended to cover.
Kevin?
So a couple points of clarification, I think. One, uniform guidance that was released in 2014 does do a very good job of outlining the difference between what a subrecipient or who a subrecipient would be
Uniform
versus a
guidance
contractor.
from the feds?
Yes, from the federal. So this would be restricted to federal dollars, although could be used as a best practice for state dollars as well. And within 200.330, it does give some pretty good outlying like definitions or examples of how you could determine whether or not they're a subrecipient or they're a contractor. For example, if they're making determinations of eligibility, that's likely the responsibility of a subrecipient, not a contractor. A contractor is someone who would be typically providing services in a competitive environment, and they'd be providing services, similar services, outside of the single environment, right? So you're providing this to more than just the LEA or whomever. So it outlines those elements within that uniform guidance. So to AAG Buse's point, it's not as simple as saying that every dollar that flows through us would then be subrecipient or subaward.
I said that.
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
the
she made the
misspoken
clarification
one.
that it wouldn't be that simple, I don't think. And so you do have to, and uniform guidance is very specific, that you have to make that determination and then typically document and support that determination. Why did we determine that this is a subrecipient as opposed to a contractor, or vice versa, so.
Just wondering, appreciate you joining us from the audit committee, giving us some background, and you as well, both of you. I guess the question is, are you getting what you need when you need to do an audit, when you have public or whatever your audit responsibilities are, public concern, or just time for audits? Are you getting the information that you need straight from the contractors or subrecipients or third-party contractors for the federal dollars? And are you getting what you need from the LEAs specifically for audit purposes after they have audited their contractors? Are you getting the information that you need from the LEA, who has the responsibility for, as a procurement entity, to audit those dollars used? Are you getting the information you need for audits purposes?
I think, if I may.
Please.
I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, I think my experience is somewhat limited, so I would hate to paint this situation with broad strokes, but my experience has been that it's difficult sometimes to get it. So if it is a a relationship in which we have subawarded something to an LEA, and an LEA has then subawarded it to a contractor or a subawardee or whatever, at times it is very difficult to get the information we need. Not only difficult for us, but difficult for the LEA sometimes to get that from their contractor. But I'm not saying that anyone's intentionally trying to be difficult, but as you increase the layers, right, it then makes the process more difficult to get the information that you need.
Chair.
I mean, and it's a good question, but our audit department, when we're auditing is one level, but when all of the monitoring, which is more of the larger, there's a ton of submittals that come into this building and they don't go through him.
Same
So that would
question
be
would
a
apply
question for
to that.
someone from operations, you could ask special ed, you could ask some of those guys, how is that coming to you and what are all of the concerns? I think they would probably be the best one to answer that question, to say, are you getting what you need?
Michelle, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to add to how much, the provision that he was talking about is 2 CFR 200-330, and it gives you a list. If these things are present, it's a sub-recipient.
Oh.
And if these things are present, it's a contract. And then it says, it kind of really doesn't matter what the individual entity calls it. They can call it what they want, but we're going to look at these factors to determine whether the relationship they have with this third party is actually a subrecipient and therefore subject to all of the terms of the law that the entity is itself, or whether it's a contract.
And just to make sure I understand, if the elements of a subrecipient are present, then the LEA or the SEA would have oversight over the subrecipient's use of those funds. If it's a contract, the SEA would probably not have.
Correct.
Depending, and the name isn't as important, but rather the elements that exist. Mike?
Yeah, I love this question that Cindy brought up. Are you getting what you need? Because that's ultimately what we want to determine, right? If we're not getting what we need, that's a problem. Secondly, I don't want to have a third-party vendor of any kind be demotivated to work with an educational provider. I mean, there's, like you mentioned, there's some great expertise out there. It's great to leverage that. We need it, and it's important. And if we start creating this hurdle that makes it difficult for them, then I think we may lose opportunities to work with some great vendors. Secondly, is in the code, Michelle, does it state a triggering event that would initiate an audit? So, or is that just subjective to whoever wants to initiate an audit of a third-party vendor?
It depends on the program that the funds are coming from.
Right.
Each program has its own monitoring and enforcement provision. There are general monitoring and enforcement provisions in the federal law for federal funds. But then within that, each program, like Title I has its own specific, special ed has its own, of what the factors are that make it be at high risk and subject to a more strict.
Okay, those high risk, those would be then the triggers that would initiate some kind of an audit.
But they can also do random
But
audits,
we have
can
to
they
do
not?
ongoing monitoring.
And they can,
Right.
and they do random audits just because they feel like it. Kevin?
And I think it's important to note that there is a distinction between audit and monitoring, right? So when you ask, is there some trigger that, that would initiate an audit, that is one question, but there is a requirement to monitor.
Right.
Which a lot of people do not perceive differently from an audit. So you have this ongoing monitoring of how are you using the funds, how is this, how are the objectives being met? So that feels a lot like an audit, even though it's not an audit. So, and that's typically ongoing, where audits are usually hindsight post activity, right? And we come back and say, okay, were the funds used according to the objectives of the subaward. So there are two things at play here. And the monitoring is ongoing. It is taking place throughout.
And when we monitor these third-party vendors, do we get what we are looking for? Do we achieve our goal?
That's what they say in the law is the ultimate question.
Yeah.
That we are trying to get at but trying to also pull all the pieces together. Are we getting what we want from third-party providers, which might be a subrecipient or might be a contractor? And that's that's our challenge, is to see if we're not getting, or if we are getting what we need. We covered in a very rambling way, the questions on the first page, and brings us to some of the questions on the second page. One of which is a little different than, that's a little different than the money that we need to track or we need to follow, but it's the protection of data, since student data is so highly protected, and often that's the responsibility of a third-party provider. One of the questions that was suggested that we address is, and this is maybe something for Michelle again or Kevin, do you feel like there's adequate student data protection? And I guess that would go to employee data protection too, different elements sometimes, by third-party providers. Go ahead.
So I noticed that David Slay is in the audience, and he's with our student data privacy. I would invite him, if it's not opposed to the board,
David,
to come
you
up
want
and
to
maybe
speak a
answer
little
that
bit to
question.
that? Although, let me just mention, I think we're going to try to end by about 3:20, just so we don't completely talk this thing to death. So, and I'm not suggesting that you would talk for 20 minutes, David, ever, but.
So wrap it up.
Thanks for giving me my boundaries to work in. David Soleil, Student Data Privacy Auditor. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, we were just saying that not only are we wanting to be concerned about where money goes to a third party, where it's funds that go to a third party provider, but we're also saying sometimes a third party provider's responsibility is use of, protection of student data. And since that's a real highly sensitive issue, are there concerns that that's not adequately protected? Do we need to worry about that, or what's your thoughts on that?
Define adequately.
Well, to the extent the law requires.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to say most of the provisions are in the law or in rule. We have been working very hard to ensure that here at USBE that those standards are included in every agreement that involves student data. We have those review processes. We've been working with LEAs to reach a similar level of standards. With that said, it's just things that they are agreeing to on a piece of paper.
Have you done monitoring yet?
We've done a small amount of monitoring, but again, it becomes very hard, I think, to reach out. Like, for instance, last year I reached out to Questar to try and get information on certain provisions, and had they done the training that was in the agreement that they said they would do, and they said, we will get back to you, and it took quite a while for them to start sending information. And then also it became apparent that maybe monitoring of their compliance with privacy provisions was not our biggest concern with Questar at the moment. And so we backed off a little, knowing the issues that were happening with that assessment. And so there's a variety of challenges with the monitoring also, is somebody has to, reach out to their technology person, or very often it's a different person than the point of contact that you might already have with them. We're looking at ways right now to try and scale that and be able to do more just for USBE. A lot of the contracts that LEAs will have will include provisions for that auditing or monitoring. I don't know to what degree they have the capacity to do that, particularly when it's ones that are not, that are essentially free. Those are the ones we hear about a lot, are, the free websites, ones where you don't have to pay anything, ones that don't have to go through the procurement code because they are just software you sign up for. So honestly, similar to the answer we got earlier of, what all is being outsourced, and the answer of everything, just in the sense of everything, I think some are probably doing very well. Hopefully this committee is aware of the data privacy agreement, the standard terms that we have created that LEAs can use. Some vendors are very quick to jump on it and say, yes, we want that, and they sign it very quickly. Others drag their feet. Others say, we don't have the capacity to review these kinds of terms. What's in our standard terms, that's all we'll agree to. So I would say it is highly variable and very, very hard to monitor at a scalable level to give a more precise answer.
And just to ask you a simpler question, have you done any monitoring of any subrecipient who maintains student data? Maybe I'm blending terms, but to know, and have you found that there are problems? Yes or no? Just-
No, I have not done that.
Done
But
anymore.
the FERPA and the Student Data Protection Act, they don't draw that distinction between subrecipients, so I'm not completely
don't.
clear on the difference.
Yeah, but you've not ever looked at the third party that might be maintaining the data for a LEA to see if that data is securely maintained, is what
And for an LEA, certainly also not, because the law, again, going back to, I'm clearly authorized, to be looking at those things when it is an agreement with USBE and a provider. LEAs, it's their own agreements.
it would be their problem, is what you're saying.
Essentially, yeah.
You had something, Mark?
Yeah, and I did. And this kind of ties to both Board Member Haynes' comment and then where you're at. We're not in the business, USBE, we are not in the business of getting much of anything, if not nothing, from third-party providers. We get, whatever we get from LEAs. So then the LEA, if we have requests, we get submissions, we get things, we get it from the LEA, and if the LEA is using the third-party providers, then they have to reach out to their third-party provider and get whatever it is that we're trying to get. And on the assurances that things are happening and stuff, I would go back to that. We can't see, we don't, today, the way I understand this, we don't get to see past the LEA. And even on the data privacy, it's up to them. And so is that a risk? And we're saying yes. Are all these things a little bit of a risk? Yes. So I just wanted to make that clear and come back to Board Member Haynes. When you ask, USBE, are we getting everything we need from a third party? We don't do business with a third party provider unless we contract with that third party provider through USBE directly.
And I guess, I think I was maybe the one that was that far-reaching or that pointed, but I guess my question, where my mind was going, was if the SEA asks for the LEA for that information, the LEA doesn't provide it, the LEA is just out of luck, or the SEA is just out of luck and says, oh, too bad, legislature, we can't get that information from the LEAs. Or does the SEA have some responsibility to,
Very good question.
do we beat LEAs over the head, or do we say, hey, well, we have ways, we have means, we've got a bigger stick that we can then go, and I'm not suggesting, kind of like Kevin started, I'm not suggesting this is what we should do, I'm just saying, is that the responsibility of an SEA? If the SEA does not get from the LEA what it needs, or is it just, we say, oh, too bad, so sad? Michelle, what do you?
I don't think it's your responsibility. I think when you set the parameters for what your monitoring and enforcement is, it's their responsibility to work with their third-party provider to make sure that the third-party provider is providing the documents they need to be able to meet their requirements in terms of compliance to the SEA.
And if it doesn't happen,
then they're held responsible, the LEA is held responsible for not providing the information that the SEA needed. And
If I
so
might just-
that's where it would end.
I know you got an interest of time, but the challenge is, as we talk to our LEAs and we want to get this, and they say, well, we don't have it, they have it.
yeah,
And then it's like, well,
who's on first?
we don't have it, and what are you asking for? It's not in our contract. It wasn't part of that, but yet we have things in statute and rule, but it's only it ends at the LEA. And so now, because we're asking for it, not all, but it puts extra pressure on the third-party provider to now get into that compliance business that the LEA is supposed to be in, to assure the LEA is getting what they need. And so that's what kind of brings.
So go ahead.
Can
then
I provide you a real example?
Yes,
A
please.
real example is special education.
Uh-huh.
So if an LEA contracted with an outside provider to provide special ed services for a student that they were unable to provide for, when the state does monitoring, they only hold the LEA responsible, and legally, the LEA is who it lands on. The LEA can't brush it off onto their third-party provider. It's the LEA's responsibility to make sure the third-party provider is fulfilling the terms of the contract that the LEA had with the third-party provider. The SEA does not get to go past the LEA.
Would it be appropriate, and hang on one sec, Royce, thank you for wanting to make a comment. Would it be appropriate then for an SEA to sort of guard the use of public money to say, LEA, you can only make agreements with third-party providers who will provide you the information that is required under state standards? I mean, would that be one way to address that concern?
I can't answer that. That's too broad, because what they could be asking them to provide may not have anything that they needed to, that the third-party provider needed to document, other than a receipt. If you're talking about supplying crayons, they're not going to be having to come up with anything. So to paint a broad picture over something that is so diverse, I can't answer right off the top of my head.
But I'm kind of getting at what and hang on 1 second, Royce, you're being really patient. I'm sort of getting at what the state board's resolution was for the High School Activities Association, where the board decided to not say we won't try to audit or monitor the High School Activities Association, but we will tell LEAs that you cannot make agreements with associations that don't do A, B, and C. So at least it happened one time, and I'm just looking if the analogy would be, is replicable for other kinds of situations. Royce, you want to come up and make a comment about any of those moving parts?
That's part of that umbrella with that situation. That umbrella just moved to the LEA.
Oh, it stayed over the
And
LEA.
the LEA is actually, because
The umbrella only stayed over the LEA, but we told the LEA what to do, or we'll
and
withdraw our
They
umbrella.
had to come under the umbrella.
Yes, indeed. Royce, go ahead. Any comments you can add?
So I've really appreciated this. There are a lot of difficult and frankly interesting parts. I'm not going to try and respond to all of them, but one of the questions, could you prohibit, or could you reach down and as an SEA do have something to that third-party contract? Or another way of thinking about it, and it occurred to me when the conversation came up about special ed. If your special ed person, you monitor, and LEAX has done it in-house, and they've done something wrong, you, the LEA, are never going to remove that person that worked for the LEA for having done that. That will inevitably be a responsibility of the LEA. There was an employee who did something inappropriate.
The SEA is not going to fire the
Yeah, you're
person, is
never
what
going to
you're-
do that.
Okay.
And in many instances, what we're talking about here is that instead of hiring somebody to do that in-house, they have opted to do that in a third-party relationship. Now, you, I think, have every right. It's entirely appropriate. And that's really what the Code of Federal Regs and your own rules say. We're going to hold the LEA accountable. And if I'm the board chair at C.S. Lewis Academy, and if you come to me and say, I need this data, and I respond and say, I gave it to Stan and I can't get it from Stan, your response ought to be, I don't care what you can't get from Stan. You made an agreement, Royce, as the board chair of C.S. Lewis, to provide us this. What agreements you made, that's for you to figure out, but you have to give it to us. And there are very significant penalties. I mean, we talk about that in different circumstances that can be made. We've seen this, heavens. One of my favorite stories was when an LEA failed to submit their financial reports for a couple of years. And eventually, they got the message that that had to happen. There were a lot of people that helped them do that, but frankly, it is not, it has to happen. You have the authority to do that, but you would never go and say, no, we're gonna, we, the SEA, are gonna fire that person, or you have to. You say, this is a responsibility. We're gonna hold you accountable, Royce. You screwed up.
And that's a little more nuanced too. I
It
think
is.
sometimes
I have a
there are
question.
occasions where the SEA says that person's behavior was so bad that the person's no longer going to be able to work there.
In the licensing
Through
world,
licensing world.
sure, I
But
appreciate
That
that.
also might go to the distinction between contractor and subrecipient. If the analogy is a subrecipient, then the SEA, as I think I understand what Michelle explained and what Kevin talked about, there are some times when the SEA might have an ability to go to the subrecipient.
No, I think you're right.
I think, I'm not positive
I
yet either.
suspect you're right there. One of the challenges in making that determination, 330 doesn't say if you check these boxes, the decision is made. It says you're talking about degrees of likeliness. You know how.
It's an art as well as a science.
Exactly. So we can't think of this as, oh, we checked that box, therefore we're there. It points in a direction, but it doesn't necessitate. And so, yeah, there are some challenges. But, you know, I think that these are important conversations. I am frankly thrilled, and you know, this is a little bit of an editorial, and you may.
We'll give you 30 seconds for it.
Thank you. But what we're talking about here is a lot of innovation that in many ways comes because we've had an explosion in the number of LEAs and because the average size of LEAs is by and large gotten smaller. And so we see a smaller LEA has some flexibility and there are some advantages there, and then there are some disadvantages, and some of those are what we're talking about. But you know, to Board Member Haynes' earlier point, we want to be able to take advantage of the expertise that's there. Not everybody is able to pull together all of the resources that Alpine or Park City is, but we do expect everyone to do that. And so we have to do some things a little bit differently, and third-party providers is one way of accomplishing that.
Fair. Thank you for your comments. Mr. Lockhart, would you like also to make a comment?
Thank you. So, as many of you
Probably
know,
should
I'm Stan Lockhart. Today I'm representing My Tech High. We're a third-party provider of curriculum for districts, for a couple of districts in the state. This issue has now come up since my days on the board, and it comes up over and over again. And I'm actually grateful that you would bring it up in the format you brought it up. In fact, Chairman Huntsman and I had this discussion a year ago where I said, let's just have an open discussion about the issue and see if we can figure some things out. And I think that's why it's here like this. If there are problems in getting the right information to the state, then we need to solve those problems. I'm somewhat sympathetic if there are problems. Each time this issue comes up, we have a really hard time defining what the specific problems are that we're trying to solve. Who is doing what that isn't giving us the right information, and what information is that we're not getting? It's been hard for me to discover that, and whoever knows that information, I think if we would approach it from that angle, we could narrowly target how to get this with the least amount of pain. But we keep proposing rules, and rules are broad-based, and they reach out to everyone. And because of that, we kind of have these possible unintended consequences that might not only solve the problem, but go far beyond that and just make it hard to, when you get third parties who are hesitant to contract because of the hassles involved, I think we're defeating kind of the purpose of having some of this creativity and innovation in education.
And I agree, there is that balance between fiscal responsibility and innovation sometimes. But let me give you an example, and this is also going to explain why we can't sometimes pinpoint the problem and make it as narrow as the problem. I work with some charter schools that have on occasion gone to their third-party providers and asked for information. And the third-party providers stonewalls the charter schools, and stonewalls and stonewalls and stonewalls. And the state, meanwhile, is beating on the LEA to say, you've got to provide this information. Well, I can't get it from my provider. I can't. He's not giving it to me, or he's giving me gobbledygook. And that makes, and the LEA does not want to go to the state and say, wait, I can't give you this because I have this really bad contract with a provider that I didn't very artfully negotiate, and so I can't give you the information. So it doesn't want to identify himself or itself, and so the problem keeps swirling around and saying, why doesn't the state help us by getting to these third-party providers who are not providing us the information that we need to give to the state to keep us going. So there's a reason that we can't narrow this appropriately, at least in my experience.
Let me just throw one more quick. What is it, sometimes that is true, they won't, or they drag their feet. The other is, they don't have it to give, and they say, well, I was never under contract for that. We're sitting right here and I'm saying, hey, you're out of business because of your third-party provider. Oh, I can't be out of business. I have
Students to serve.
I have 500 students. You're closing my doors because, oh, you got into a bad deal. I mean,
Yeah,
this
that's
is
true.
what we're trying to keep it way up here without getting down into
And
the
there is
specifics.
taxpayer
So
money.
are we going to be proactive or dialogue forever? And that's why we were kind of talking
And it
about
does seem like there are some rules that are maybe going to be slightly overbroad from some people's perspective, but that prospectively address these kinds of problems, because you aren't going to get the small LEA/charter school coming to the board saying, I'm so sorry, but let me just show you this horrible contract that I got into, and now I can't get what you need. Or they're not gonna out their third-party provider and say, that third-party provider had no ability, had no capacity to do what I contracted with them to do. It's not that they usually stonewall, in my experience, because it's turned into mush in the third party, whether it's student data or whether it's an assessment, and I'm just throwing out examples. I don't have examples of those, or whether it's financial records. I'm making them up. They're all mythical. None of them are from real stories. So I'm just saying that that's one of the reasons that we need to make these rules, because it's hard for that small LEA to be forthcoming.
Okay.
And it makes them look like a bad actor when maybe they were naive at worst.
So the last time we went to the legislature on this topic, it's been 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Huge debate, and what the debate ended up centering on was the role of the state board versus the role of local boards. And while the state board does have general supervision and control over public education constitutionally, they've chosen over the last 130, 40 years to use that in a way where we put most of the emphasis on local control, most of the emphasis on parents, teachers, and administrators at the local school. And so we've kind of created these divisions where we have our local LEAs are in charge of educating our kids, and the state board ends up being We're in charge of compliance of state and local laws and appropriations, and we're a pass-through for other appropriations. And in general, that's where we've made our division, right? And so as we start talking about the state overseeing contracts of third-party providers, we're kind of going into new territory here. We're kind of shifting some of the fundamental responsibilities that we've had for 100 and some odd years. And so as I sit there and look at it, and that was really the legislative discussion that we had last time. And so what did the legislature tell us to do? They said, why don't you start requiring things in contracts so that the locals know what they need to be requiring? And so they did. They put in a handful of things. And I would just suggest that maybe we follow that same pattern, that if there are other things that we're looking for, then let's require them to be a part of the contracts that our third-party providers sign with the local LEA. And it'll be an iterative process. We won't catch them all, Carol. I mean, granted, we're going to still have some of the same problems we're having. But over time, as we start addressing these on a very specific level, we can start putting those protections in there that can give the auditors, that can give the LEAs the information to give to the auditors. And that way we can get to where we need to go. Rather than some broad-brushed, I mean, we bring these proposals, I mean, really, we've been bringing them since I've been on the board, and they're all geared around, you know, putting more control over third-party providers. And instead of that, I would go to those contracts and I would say, okay, what's the most recent problem? Well, let's go require this to be in the contract. And over time, there will be a long list.
And yeah, and that's a helpful, at least that's one of the first suggestions we've had that might help this. And that's a very helpful suggestion. I think one of the dilemmas about that is sometimes there are 160 plus LEAs now, some of which don't have the sophistication to write contracts that are consistent sometimes with those requirements.
Okay,
And-
but that I think goes to the heart of the matter. We should give them the tools so that they can have the types of contracts that can protect them.
So maybe that would be more money for every LEA to hire a contract person. So if maybe
Well,
funding from legislature.
My argument, and then I'm done. My argument is if we start coming up with these broad-based rules with the ability to monitor third parties, and a couple of administrative rules meetings ago, they started talking about going 10 levels deep. Suddenly you've created a bureaucracy and the need to hire people here at the state office in a way that you've never seen before.
That's
a challenge.
David, you had a comment, and then I think we maybe need to conclude with some suggestions? Go ahead. Not my meeting.
This is philosophical. But I just, since you're up here and helping with the conversation, I'm kind of going back to where you said third parties may get to a point they don't want to participate in education because of the hassles involved. I'm trying to wrap my head around it because I remember Representative Rob Bishop came recently and he said, if government is involved or government money is involved, there will always be hassles. And if you don't want the hassles, don't use the government money. And I'm trying to wrap my head around what you said and what he said and just ask the question to you. If we don't want the hassles, what would cause any LEA to just not become a flow-through? We'll be a flow-through for money, and we'll put all the money into a private LLC, and then we won't have to deal with any hassles. We won't have to tell any taxpayers what we're doing. Really, with the money, we won't have to publish teacher salaries. We won't have to publish director salaries. We won't have to have anyone see how the taxpayer dollars are really being used because we don't want those hassles. What would preclude every LEA from just doing that? Because it's so freeing, right?
Which is sort of the model of some charter schools.
Help me this question is for you. Help me understand that piece.
So there's no question that when you're working with, actually, it's not just reserved for education, anything in government, whether it's federal or state, that there are always some additional steps that you have to take. I spend quite a bit of time with some of my clients selling into government, and so that you're absolutely right, there are. But there's kind of a reasonableness standard, and if the standards are different in Utah and they're far more restrictive than the other 49 states, then if it's easier and it's less expensive and it's less of a burden for the vendor, they'll just ignore Utah. So it really has to do with this, what is my burden compared to other places? Not so much is there a burden. Of course there's a burden, and of course with taxpayer dollars there's a level of accountability that is different than the private sector. I don't disagree with that at all. But it's so I'll give you a great example. We've been doing Portrait of a Graduate now for a couple of years. And what's come of that is personalized learning, competency-based learning, new models that are innovative that can really help kids and stimulate their progression through our public school system. And it's really cool. In that space, there are many, many, many third-party providers. And those third-party providers are looking at Portrait of a Graduate saying, I want to partner with some Utah LEAs because the state has put their stakes in the ground and said, we want to do this. But if you make the requirements more difficult than the other 49 states, they're going to sit there and say, well, on the one hand, they're saying they want us. On the other hand, they're saying they don't want us. Maybe we'll just back off. And so it's relative to to the burden in other places. And today, the burden is no more intrusive in Utah than it is in other states. And then there are different rules that are required, but there's different structures of education in other states. Other states are built differently. Sometimes they have very centralized control. And in those cases, they would have far more onerous requirements for that centralized monitoring of what they're doing. But we have this system where we've decided over a long period of time since statehood that we're going to let LEAs be in charge of working with parents and students to get the education of our children, and that we're going to act as a compliance and a pass-through, and in some cases, there will be some statewide programs that will run. Well, now we're kind of flipping that on its head and saying, no, we're going to drill down into those contracts.
We're not there yet.
said that.
We're-
Oh, no.
Yeah,
But
we're just discussing out loud what some possibilities are.
I'm saying that in a hypothetical way as we just
We're
look at the
thinking out loud
history of
about
this
it.
issue.
And thank you. Cindy, did you have other? I'd like to
I
leave
just
our
guess, just so
staff
my
with
question
some
is, so
work.
there's nothing legally right now to preclude every single LEA in the state to be sort of a pass-through entity and put all of their WPU money into a private LLC and then
make it opaque for.
The answer to your question is,
That-
I don't know. I'm guessing that there are a whole host of structural requirements that we make in order to get an LEA created that might make that difficult.
And that's a thought. I think that's one of our challenges. Just in the last, and thank you for your
it's
comments.
hypothetical.
Thank you for your
I just am wondering, you
thoughtful
make it sound
insight.
wonderful, I'm thinking, could that be a reality?
Yeah. Cindy, let's hear one more comment from David, and then let's see if we have any kind of questions we have for our staff to bring us some information or some possible solutions back next month. But Dave, did you?
Well, and I don't know that it's a solution for everything, but I just wanted to, well,
Hey.
if I had that, I just wanted to again mention our data privacy agreement program, mostly because Stan mentioned again where it's like, the legislature took the approach of put in the law that contracts have to say certain things.
Yeah.
And that is what the state's privacy law says. If you are contracting, these privacy provisions need to be addressed.
Yep.
And so this is the approach we took of, again, we created a state version that is not something we're entering with them, but that the LEAs can use. It's a completely voluntary program. There's no rule that says you have to use this agreement. The law says your agreements have to contain these things.
Elements.
Exactly. But you can use our version and other LEAs can subscribe onto it, which typically ends up being the case with these kinds of agreements, largely because, again, it is a lot of those, so-called free websites where you're not procuring specific services. It's the same as everyone. So I just wanted to say it is currently growing and has proven to be very popular with LEAs. Not perfect. There's lots of things we're still working on as it grows. But that is a possible thing, again, just thinking where it's like, if we're going to put things in contracts, we can standardize things. That can be a great role for the SEA.
Which is sort of a variation on my UHSAA example of if you contract with with an association, then it has to meet these, then that contract has to satisfy these requirements. So, do we have as a committee any requests for our staff to bring us back information or models or anything next month that might help us move in some more linear path to kind of address these concerns? Yes.
I'm going to say what I'm interested in, and then I'll figure out how to, or someone else can make a motion. I don't know.
Okay. It doesn't have to be it's not an action item, so.
Well, maybe these are just questions and maybe not an action. I don't know. So I'm interested in what Stan said about the other states and what are other states doing. I'm interested in some research that way. I'm interested in knowing if data privacy is part of our procurement codes or if that's only financial. So maybe I'm interested in more information about procurement. Are procurement rules being followed? I don't even know what they are, but I know people have contacted me saying they're not being followed. So I'd like more information about that. And in our monitoring processes, what have we learned about that? Do we have the information that we need to know if procurement rules are being followed? And then I just am interested in knowing from various parts of staff who are responsible for monitoring if we have the information that we need to do what we are supposed to do. I don't want to contradict the law. I want to know what is our responsibility and do we have what we need to do it? So I move that we ask staff to do all of that in all of their spare time.
So the last one was, does the USB have the information it needs to meet the USBE or SEA requirements?
What are our monitoring and auditing responsibilities? And do we have what we need to do it? And if not, what do we need to change so that we can do our responsibilities appropriately? It's a really long question.
At least we've got a few questions. Mike, did you have any thoughts? Mark?
I'm not going to be in your committee next time, but I think it'd be really, well, I'd love to if finance gets out pretty quick. The other part of this question is, and this is all about accountability and that, and I wish Royce was sitting here because I'd just look at him as an LEA, but with this trend and more outsourcing, how is there a way, and maybe we bring in LEAs, maybe we talk to some other vendors. This is just my opinion and on this. Is the vendor growth, which is entirely different this year than it was 4 years ago or 10 years ago. It didn't happen. I don't know if it happened unless somebody was leasing their milk cow or something at the
Keep going,
schoolhouse
Mark. I'm losing the thread of your question.
But I'm just going to dive into this. Is there anything we can do on our end to help our LEAs protect themselves from the bad agreements, and how on our end can we require, depending on the risk side, that they hold their third-party providers somehow more accountable? Because the new threat I see is I see that third-party providers can sink a school and put us in a position that we don't want to be in, that can jeopardize whether that school is going to exist or not. And I don't think anyone's going to or disagree with me. So that's why we're talking. We're not beating up the innovative pieces. And Stan, this is important for your community. We're not saying it's bad. It's just how do we manage it, and how do we do it and have those assurances that kids are safe, the dollars are where they need to be, that LEAs can do this and know that they're going to get what they need to come back to be in compliance. That's all we're doing.
And I think one of the things that I would have liked to have said to you, Stan, in your discussion was, we have a legislature that is a little bit, and this is not, I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, it's a little bit schizophrenic. On the one hand, they really value innovation, they really value bringing private business into the government world. On the other hand, they want very strong accountability. And those two don't always match up. So sometimes it's the legislature saying, here's the money, we trust you to use it wisely, and there aren't going to be 3 reports and 5 audits required. And so sometimes it's the challenge of matching up the accountability requirements with the innovation desires of all involved. So I think Angie was typing busily, and we've got some things we want. Anything else that you folks? I think I would like to ask, because I keep bringing it up and I keep thinking it's a possibility. I'd like to look at that, and it's R277-409. I would like to look at the UHSAA idea of LEAs may only contract with third-party providers that do A, B, and C. And see if that's a model that might work for these concerns. I don't know if it will. You can come back to me and say, no, for these reasons. You can come back to say, maybe. You can, I'm just curious. Sure.
And I'm kind of looking past David over to Scott, because I'm wondering, is there a model, and this can be part of our research later, but it seems to me like I recalled that in a certain state, when it comes to data tools, like the tools that student information systems, for example, and it could be Georgia. Is it Georgia or is it North Carolina? I don't know which one, or if it's neither. But okay, but the law has allowed the SEA to establish requirements for third-party providers who engage in certain activities, and say, if you're going to have a student information system, for example, Georgia, thank you, you have to meet these requirements, and they have a really good, apparently, relationship, the SEA with the third-party providers. The third-party providers get training directly from the SEA. They work well together. And I've always wondered if there isn't some way to also have like an elevated third-party provider stamp of approval or relationship that then you could have some more of that interaction. But anyway, that's an example of a state I know that has the authority to require third-party providers that provide that type of service to meet certain criteria.
Which I think goes to Cindy's comment from an hour ago of what are other states doing? And that would be productive and useful for us to look at and not reinvent things, because I think we're all looking for the same thing. We want that perfect moment between innovation and accountability, and we don't like to see schools explode. We don't like to see students disadvantaged, and so we're looking for that. So I think that we did give you, in a very roundabout way, some things that we can look at and bring us some options. Did I say that neutrally enough, Cindy? Bring us some options to consider that might satisfy the various concerns. So, thank you. One more motion? We adjourn. You took too long. Thank you so much for all of you.
Happy to do it, always.
Good to see you, Stan. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Go be friends, is that what you said? Good friends. Oh, good friends. I actually think we're gonna get there, you guys. Questions from board members. And I said that. We're gonna get it. We just want to make sure. What's the rate? Private sector remains consistent. It could change. I know, I am. Me either. This, and that's fine, so it's not, whatever. I think we change like that, I'd be like, what are you doing? But we don't change that much. But man, it is nice to have some kind of a structure.
Your meeting has ended.